The smartphone industry in 2025 stands at a crossroads, facing what could be the most disruptive shift in its history. For over a decade, Android and iOS have dominated the market, establishing a duopoly that has defined not only hardware and software standards, but also the very way we interact with technology. Android, with its vast ecosystem of devices and unparalleled flexibility, has catered to both budget and premium users worldwide, while iOS has delivered a carefully curated experience, prioritizing performance, security, and seamless integration across devices. Together, they have created a sense of inevitability. A world where smartphones are defined exclusively by these two platforms. Yet, lurking beneath the surface, a quiet revolution has been building. Linux-powered smartphones, once dismissed as niche and impractical, are now emerging as credible alternatives, offering freedoms and features that neither Android nor iOS can fully match. In 2025, the implications of this shift are profound, and for the first time, mainstream users are beginning to take notice. Unlike traditional smartphones, Linux devices are built on open-source foundations, meaning that every line of code can be audited, modified, and improved by a global community of developers. This level of transparency is unmatched in Android or iOS, where proprietary code limits both user control and independent security verification. For many, this is more than a technical detail. It represents a fundamental change in how we think about personal technology. Privacy, security, and autonomy are no longer optional features. They are built into the very architecture of these devices. Whereas Android offers partial openness through its core AOSP code, and iOS offers tight integration at the cost of flexibility. Linux phones provide complete freedom without sacrificing performance or usability. Users can install apps from multiple sources, customize interfaces down to the smallest detail, and even run full desktop Linux environments directly on their phones. This transforms the smartphone from a closed device into a personal computing platform capable of adapting to nearly any need. The performance of modern Linux phones in 2025 is also something that cannot be ignored. Early Linux mobile projects struggled with optimization and battery life, making them more of a hobbyist experiment than a serious competitor. But that has changed. Manufacturers and community-driven projects have invested heavily in refining hardware-software integration, leveraging more efficient Linux kernels, and adopting modern ARM and RISC-V architectures. Today, Linux smartphones can match, and in some cases exceed, the performance of comparable Android and iOS devices, particularly for users who value multitasking, developer tools, and productivity applications. Unlike traditional smartphones that restrict multitasking to a single layer of applications with limited intercommunication, Linux phones allow apps to run in true sandboxed environments while still enabling complex workflows, making them ideal for professionals, developers, and tech enthusiasts. Security is another area where Linux phones are beginning to redefine expectations. While both Android and iOS have made strides in protecting users from malware and unauthorized access, they remain fundamentally closed ecosystems, where the user must trust a central authority to enforce security measures. Linux phones, by contrast, allow users to audit code, apply updates independently, and employ advanced security frameworks, such as SI Linux and Apermer, in ways that are transparent and verifiable. The open-source nature of the platform also means vulnerabilities are discovered and patched by a global network of developers, rather than relying solely on corporate teams. In 2025, this approach is particularly compelling, as concerns over digital surveillance, data breaches, and platform monopolies continue to grow. For anyone who values privacy, Linux phones offer a level of control simply unavailable on mainstream platforms. The app ecosystem, historically the weakest link for Linux phones, has seen dramatic improvement. One of the primary reasons iOS and Android dominate is because of their enormous libraries of apps and services. Linux phones once suffered from limited options, often requiring technical skill to install or adapt software. However, the rise of compatibility layers, progressive web apps, and convergence with desktop Linux distributions has changed this dynamic. Users can run popular Linux software on their phones, access fully functional desktop applications in mobile form, and even run some Android apps through compatibility frameworks with surprisingly high efficiency. The growing community of developers focusing specifically on Linux Mobile also means new apps are being designed from the ground up for these devices, optimized for touchscreens while leveraging the openness and security of the Linux ecosystem. This expansion of software availability is bridging the gap that once made Linux phones impractical for the average user. From a hardware perspective, Linux smartphones have evolved from experimental devices into professional-grade machines. Companies like Pine64, with their PinePhone, Purism with Librem 5, and emerging manufacturers are offering sleek, durable devices with high-resolution displays, efficient processors, and long battery life. These devices now rival mainstream Android and iOS smartphones in terms of build quality, while offering something that neither of the incumbents can: true user sovereignty. The hardware is designed not just for performance, but also for repairability and longevity, addressing concerns about electronic waste and planned obsolescence that plague the modern smartphone market. In 2025, having a device you can fully control, maintain, and upgrade is no longer a luxury. It is a viable choice for mainstream consumers, increasingly aware of sustainability and personal privacy. Another factor that sets Linux phones apart is customization. On Android, customization exists but is ultimately constrained by OEM restrictions, pre-installed apps, and system-level limitations. On iOS, customization is minimal, with most users locked into Apple's rigid interface guidelines. Linux phones, however, allow users to tailor nearly every aspect of their device, from the kernel to the interface, to suit personal preferences or specific workflows. This level of control is especially appealing to developers, tech enthusiasts, and professionals who rely on specialized applications or workflows that mainstream platforms cannot accommodate. In addition, Linux phones can seamlessly integrate with other Linux devices, creating a cohesive ecosystem that prioritizes efficiency, flexibility, and interoperability over vendor lock-in. The broader societal implications of Linux phones cannot be overstated. With governments and corporations increasingly scrutinized for their control over user data, the ability to choose an open, auditable platform has become a matter of personal and political importance. Linux phones empower individuals to reclaim control over their digital lives in a way that Android and iOS cannot. They also encourage innovation by creating a level playing field where anyone can contribute to software development, experiment with new features, and share improvements with the community. In 2025, this represents not just a technical advantage, but a philosophical one, challenging the long-standing norms of corporate-controlled mobile ecosystems. Despite these advantages, Linux phones face challenges. Market penetration is still low compared to Android and iOS, and many users are unfamiliar with open-source systems. However, the trajectory is clear. Awareness is growing, user-friendly distributions are emerging, and the ecosystem is becoming increasingly viable for mainstream adoption. Tech companies that rely on Android or iOS may feel threatened as users begin to question the limitations of proprietary systems and demand more autonomy, security, and transparency. In particular, niche markets such as privacy-conscious users, developers, and professionals in technical fields are likely to drive early adoption, creating a ripple effect that could eventually influence the broader consumer market. In conclusion, Linux phones in 2025 are not merely a curiosity or an experimental niche. They represent a legitimate, viable alternative to the Android-iOS duopoly, offering unmatched transparency, security, performance, and customization. These devices empower users to take control of their digital lives, challenge existing norms, and embrace an ecosystem driven by community, innovation, and freedom. Android and iOS have set the standards for mobile computing for years, but the rise of Linux phones signals a turning point, a moment where control, privacy, and openness are no longer optional ideals, but competitive advantages. For consumers and developers alike, the question is no longer whether Linux phones can exist, but how soon they will become a serious threat to the platforms that have dominated our world for so long. In 2025, Linux smartphones are here, and Android and iOS have reason to be concerned.